In this episode of The Colors of Parenthood, we're excited to welcome Laura Spence, a midwife and a mother of three. Laura opens up about her personal experiences with childbirth and postpartum depression and how her own struggles inspired her to support other mothers. Join us as we delve into the multifaceted challenges of motherhood. Hello. So we have Laura today with us. I'm so glad to have you as a guest on my podcast. Could you please share a bit about your background and your journey into becoming a mom?
So, my name is Laura Spence. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It's lovely to be here. I have been a midwife for almost 13 years, and I was already a mum before I became a midwife. I had my daughter when I was about 24 years old, I think. I was really excited to have a baby. It was just, there was something about it I found quite powerful that it shifts your attention and your inner narrative away from yourself almost, gives you an external focus. And I quite enjoyed that because I'd obviously never had it before. And actually, it was from having my daughter that made me then want to go on and be a midwife. And then I also have two other children, Lewis and Max, who are 9 and 7. And I mean, parenting is just a roller coaster of fun and adventure and stress and worry and emotions. There's a lot involved in parenting. Hey.
Yeah, definitely. Could you please share what was it like? Why exactly did you wanted to become a midwife early? So, what was the specific thing that was like,
That made me.
okay, I really want to do that?
So I think when I was in labour, I hadn't really done any prep for labour and birth, and I was still quite young, probably quite naive, but also very, very, very frightened of labour, of pain, of trying to birth a child. The midwife that was looking after me, I would say she was probably the biggest inspiration of wanting to change my career after that. I think for me, it was never to do with the babies, as cute and cuddly as they are. But I think for me, that midwife that looked after me, I don't know, it came with a sense of empowerment. She made me believe in myself. She made me much less frightened. And I think I felt very supported by her. And yeah, she just really gave me a sense of belief in myself that I probably didn't have until I met her. She was a fantastic midwife in that sense. I remember she went for her tea break, and it was a different midwife who came in to relieve her and look after me while she went for her cup of tea and toast or whatever it is in the middle of the night that you have. And that midwife was terrifying. She wasn't focused on me at all. She was really focused on tidying up the room and catching up with the paperwork and directing my husband to do this, this, and this. And actually, at that point, then I felt as if I lost control. The pain seemed to become far more intense. And by the time my midwife came back from her tea break, they were citing an epidural for me. So I think I really wanted to be that person for someone. I really wanted to be able to support someone the way that I had been supported, because I could comprehend the value of that relationship between the midwife and the woman. And it's a really protected space, I think. So yeah, it was
Yeah,
that midwife that inspired me
yeah,
to, yeah.
that's such a good point because I don't think people actually realize how important is like before they get pregnant. They don't think about the first couple of days and how important is with whom you're surrounded by in the hospital
Yeah.
while in labor and after. And now that you're a midwife for so long, would you say that there's still midwives that are not really like thinking about the importance and the critique phase of giving support to those moms?
Yes, 100%. And I don't think anyone goes into the profession with that intention. I think, unfortunately, it is the circumstances of the system. I think that there are lots of traumatised midwives out there because midwives are not getting the psychological support that they need. They have vicarious trauma. The wards are very, very busy, and a lot of midwives are probably treading water. And if that's your day job, you can't imagine doing anything else. But equally, because you're doing it day to day, you don't see the impact of, it just becomes commonplace. You probably don't realise the impact that your words or your lack of connection to that woman has on her long-term mental health and therefore the relationship with her child. I think that is underestimated, the power of that relationship, hugely.
Yeah. And now, following your personal journey as a mom, could you share with us your experience of your first birth and the postpartum period that you had after?
I would say that for the most part, I really enjoyed the labour because of that midwife, I think, giving me that belief. I started off in the kind of lower risk birthing unit. I was using the ball that you can sit on. I had some gas in air. I did vomit quite a lot actually during that labour. And subsequently obviously had an epidural, and she was born by ventouse, so the suction cup that they used to bring her out. I remember feeling terrified because they took her straight over to the resuscitator, so the equipment that she just needed a little bit of support with her breathing. And then they just popped her on me, skin to skin. She was still a bit slimy. I remember feeling like, oh, she's covered in stuff. And I probably didn't feel what I thought I was going to feel, because I think society leads us to believe that as soon as you see this baby that has been growing inside your uterus, that you're going to fall madly in love with this baby. And I'm sure that happens for some people. But I think the majority of people don't. I think it takes time, and I think that's why naturally our oxytocin levels surge in that time, and that's why skin to skin is so important. Because for me, it wasn't love at first sight. It was, oh my God, what have I just been through? What have they just pulled out of me? My vagina is sore. And not that you feel a sense of resentment, but it's all because of this little being. I couldn't compute the two very quickly. And I think I was terrified because when I went up to the postnatal ward, I had a catheter in. So my bladder was just being drained because I had so many stitches down below. I was terrified to move. You're sitting in the bed and the catheter is there, and I'm frightened that I'm going to pull it out and end up causing myself some kind of long-term bladder damage. You're a bit frightened to ask for help, I think. I definitely remember feeling frightened to press my buzzer because I didn't want to annoy anyone because I could see that they were busy. Breastfeeding did not go to plan at all. I tried to breastfeed her for a couple of days and it just wasn't happening. So I ended up giving her some formula and I felt very judged. But on reflection, I think that was internal judgment for myself because I had wanted to breastfeed and I couldn't, rather than anyone making me feel bad for opting to use formula. And then I remember when we got home, it just all felt very surreal, as if it was happening to someone else. It's all kind of a bit of a blur. She is 15 now. And it's been a journey. My other two children, my middle son, Max, he was relatively quick. I think for Jodie, the first baby, was perhaps in labour for about 7.5 hours, which I think is kind of reasonably standard for a first baby. The second baby, he was born in the water after about 3 hours. And I never used any pain relief that time, just because I was desperate to get home to Jodie. And I wanted to have like a 6-hour discharge. And he breastfed really well. And I don't know if that's because I was so much more relaxed. I was a midwife by then. I knew all of the kind of tips and tricks. So I probably was a bit of an unfair advantage. And then Lewis, my final child, I had to be induced for him. I had some medical complications in pregnancy. And once they were able to break my waters, he was born 55 minutes later. And that, I think, was probably the scariest of all of my births, because it was so fast and it felt so out of my control. And then it was after he was born that I would say I had developed really bad postnatal depression. I had some birth trauma, so PTSD that needed to be treated. So I think that was probably the most traumatic one.
And would you say that because you're a midwife and probably you see other women, or at least you are aware what is postpartum depression? Because I've talked with people that said they were not aware, so like the preparedness was zero. They did not know that this can actually happen.
Mm.
Would you say that at least you were a bit prepared, knowing what postpartum depression is?
Yes and no. I think it's definitely easier to recognise in someone else. I think that for me, I certainly tended to mask it. I went into that sort of hyper independence. I can do this, masked it, internalised a lot of the symptoms, perhaps. And actually, rather than, because I felt very well bonded to the baby, rather than it being much to do with my connection to the baby or thinking I was an inadequate parent, it felt as if with 3 children, things were very much out of my ability to cope. And actually, it was probably more the 2.5-year-old that I had that was causing me the biggest anxiety. Lewis was a baby. He would feed and he would sleep, and that was that. I think there were many factors for me that fed into it, like I actually didn't have a very pleasant experience with some of my colleagues on the night shift. I could hear them discussing my labour and birth at the desk. I was just behind the curtain. I could hear every word that they were saying, which made me feel very small, made me feel judged. I remember one of the midwives, when she was leaving her shift the next morning, came and said to me, you will hear from your colleagues that I've been speaking very derogatory about you during handover, but just know that I wanted you and your baby to be in the safest place. And that for me, I think, was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. I think that gave me huge anxiety. I still get a little bit tearful actually now when I think about how I felt at that time, how that made me feel. Because not only was I vulnerable in the sense that I had just had a baby, I was also vulnerable because I had to go back to work in 6 months' time. And I would have to work beside these people. And I don't know at what extent I was being discussed inappropriately. So rather than it being the sort of the physical medical things that happened when, I was unwell after delivery and it was all very quick, that is one thing in itself, but it was that interpersonal communication that was the really difficult pill to swallow for me. Because I then worried about that. That was kind of on my mind. I ruminated over it for a long time. And I think then that impacted my ability to cope with 3 children. My husband wasn't entitled to any paternity leave. So he had 2 days off. Lewis was born on the Thursday. And my husband had the Thursday and Friday off. Then he had the Saturday and Sunday because it was the weekend. And then he was expected to be back to work on the Monday. He only gets 4 weeks annual leave a year, for which he has to keep about a week and a half of that for Christmas and New Year because the trade is obviously kind of closed for business. He's a plumber to trade. I live in the Channel Islands, and that is sort of between England and France in the English Channel. The laws are slightly different here than what they are in the UK, so there was no recognition of paternity leave at that time, which I think played a big factor in the fact that I never had as much support as I probably needed. Had he had more time off, maybe things might have settled down a good bit for me, because he would have been there to help with, taking. I think he did take the kids to school in the mornings, and he would pick them up in the afternoons once they were finished. I say kids, it was only Jodie that was at school actually, so I still had Max and the baby at home. But I think it definitely complicated matters. I was kind of left to my own devices in the day, to my own thought processes. Not much support at home. So I think that wider societal structure definitely has a huge impact on maternal and paternal mental health.
Yeah, and I am really surprised, like speaking with other people from different countries. This is really low, and specifically for not parental leave for your husband. And definitely, this speaks about how different environmental factors are affecting postpartum experience, not only the main symptoms and signals that we learn about from the literature. And this is a really important topic, because many women n- don't they would feel the bond as you did, and they would think this is not postpartum depression, probably because that is the main symptom that people speak about.
Yeah.
um, and I wanted to ask you, because I already know that you are diagnosed with ADHD. How did that affect you being a parent?
So obviously I didn't know at the time that I had ADHD.
Okay.
And it was when I was 37 years old. So I think I must have been 32 when I had Lewis, the youngest one. And I'm now 39. It was only after I went through all of the talking therapies for postnatal depression. I've been on and off antidepressants since I was about 14 years old. Excuse me. I think I didn't have an idyllic childhood. There were certainly a few childhood traumas. For example, my father went to prison after he and my mum got divorced. He is a convicted paedophile, after having, I think it was indecent messages to a 12 or 13-year-old girl. So my mum and dad got divorced, I think, when I was around 5 years old. He went on to have more of a family with another woman. So I do have some half siblings. And it was a bit further down the line, maybe when I was 12, 13, 14-ish, that it was found he had downloaded some kind of child pornography, I guess. And he subsequently went to prison. So I haven't actually had any contact with my father since I was about 11 years old. So then when I started, going through puberty, reaching the teenage years, everything felt very overwhelming to me. Every emotion I felt was huge. I was either very, very, very happy, or I was absolutely heartbroken because someone hadn't replied to a text message, or someone had looked at me the wrong way and I would think that they didn't like me. And so I very quickly became a people pleaser in life and learned to adapt, I think, my personality, I guess, in order to fit in with the group of people I was with at the time. I think I became a bit of a chameleon because I wanted them to like me and I desperately wanted to be accepted. But to the point now where I got to the age of 37, I'd had my children, I'd had talking therapies, I'd been on antidepressants. I went through a few rounds of EMDR therapy in order to treat the post-traumatic stress following the birth, which, we did a lot of work as well on childhood elements. But I think that's another thing that we need to recognise, is the trauma that people are bringing with them into parenting very much influences how you parent and how you feel about parenting and the way you talk to yourself and your own mental health. I think that my dad was probably undiagnosed ADHD. Now that really when I hear, because I don't vividly remember a lot of things from when I was younger, but I think judging by a lot of the stories that my mum tells, I think that he probably had ADHD and potentially that's where I get it from. But it was following, so my daughter is 15 now, and probably since she was about 5 years old, it had been apparent to us that she had some developmental challenges, and she's diagnosed autistic. I think she probably has ADHD as well. She has a lot of kind of physical health concerns. She has epilepsy. And I think it was when we were going through the process of filling in forms in order to get her assessed that I thought, oh my gosh, a lot of this sounds like me. And I would say to my husband, gosh, listen to this. Do you not think this describes me? But I couldn't work out at that time because actually it probably took me about 2 years to actually reach out for an assessment, because I had spent all of my life adapting, people pleasing. Essentially, I didn't know who I was at the core. I don't know what made up my personality, because it felt as if I was a bit of a patchwork quilt. I was just made up of all of these bits of everyone that I'd ever met, because I had blended into those situations and been such a people pleaser. I didn't know what my core identity was. And so when it came to looking at, a list of symptoms on a page in terms of ADHD, I talked myself out of it, I think, because I thought, oh, you're just trying to fit yourself in the way that you always have done around other people. You're trying to attach something now to this. And I think I probably ruminated on it for a couple of years. And then I went for a private assessment. And I very quickly, they came back saying, you fit the diagnosis of combined type ADHD. And actually, probably that was the biggest catalyst for a lot of change in my life. And my mental health now, as a result of that diagnosis, is far better than it's ever been in my entire life. Aside from, I am medicated now for ADHD, but I think aside from the medication, the biggest thing is is the diagnosis, and learning how that fits in with your life, and what that means in terms of your family, etc. I think that's definitely been the biggest catalyst for positive
Yeah.
change. Definitely.
Yeah, I can totally see how being diagnosed with something definitely brings awareness and makes you more um understand yourself, to understand yourself more and to know yourself more,
Yeah.
which I think many people don't know. Like, it's a long journey, and underdiagnosis is quite high. Uh, Basically, I think it's because it's different in cultures and it's depending also on our health system. So I know in the UK it's quite hard to get diagnosis because it's a long waiting list. And for instance, in Bulgaria, it's private, so it's quite easy. It's just not accessible for everyone.
Yeah.
So it's like it depends.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Usually.
and how does that actually like affected your parenting? So are you more aware of like how ADHD can also be like either a help or how to use it more like being yourself and being a better parent?
Yes. Well, I think that really starts with um, it starts with yourself, doesn't it? I think for a long time I've always had a very negative inner critic. So the narrative that I would give myself, I would beat myself up a lot, in the metaphorical sense, of course, that had I shouted at the kids or had I not felt that I had done enough with them that day, I would really talk to myself in a very negative way about how I was an inadequate mother, or, if I'd made one of them cry because I shouted too loud, then I would really make myself feel very bad and very guilty about that. Things like I used to make an appointment for parents' night, for example, and would forget all about it. I wouldn't set myself. Hang on, I can hear my son in the background there, and he keeps making a clicking noise. I don't know if you can hear it. Will you stop that? It's very distracting. And that's the thing. I do find myself like I was struggling to concentrate on what I was talking to you about there, because I could hear this click, click in the background. I'm like, ugh, stop that. Um, and I think that's another thing about ADHD that's underestimated is the sensory stimulation is very similar to people who perhaps are autistic. That you can very easily become overwhelmed with that external noise. But in terms of my parenting, I would forget parents' night, and then the teacher might approach me in the playground and say, "Oh, we were expecting to see you last night at parents' night," and I would think, "Oh my God, they must think I'm a really terrible person," and then I would start crying because I would think that they think I'm a shit mum. That perception of being criticised, that we refer to actually as rejection sensitive dysphoria, is huge in my life. Like a really big emotional, painful reaction to something that actually is quite out of context for that type of reaction. Sometimes you would think that a parent had died, or I was completely heartbroken by divorce or the loss of someone, just because somebody beeped their horn at me in traffic. That I would have a really, really, really serious emotional reaction that when I play it over and ruminate on it in my mind, would still be having those big reactions days later, because I'd be like, "Oh, that man shouted at me." I think it's huge, but since I've been diagnosed and I understand it much better, I'm a lot more accepting of myself. I'm a lot more forgiving, and I have a better explanation now to give the kids, other than saying, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I was a bad mum today."
Hmm.
Remember, mum has ADHD, and that just means that sometimes I might forget. So if you remember before I do, just give mum a reminder,
Yeah.
or help mum look at the calendar, whatever. I think I
Yeah.
think it's not just beneficial to have that diagnosis or that identity for yourself, it's also hugely beneficial for your family and the people that you live with. I think my husband has really benefited from my diagnosis and my explanation of things now. It has taken him a while, but especially in terms of the hormonal impact, of menstrual cycle and different phases of my menstrual cycle means that my symptoms differ. So, for example, the week before my period is due, typically that is when my estrogen level is low. So estrogen, for those of you who don't know, estrogen is one of the main female sex hormones,
Yes.
and plays a huge part in your menstrual cycle. And estrogen and dopamine work together. So if your estrogen level is high, generally then so is your dopamine level. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter for estrogen, and it's also one of the kind of key components of ADHD. You might, we tend to dopamine seek things. When my estrogen is high and my dopamine is therefore high, things feel great in the world. My symptoms are minimal. My mental health is great. I feel energised, ready to take on the world, which is usually the first couple of weeks of my menstrual cycle. That phase, though, post-ovulation, so from kind of day 14 to day 28, where my estrogen starts to decline, and therefore then so does my dopamine, my symptoms, especially in the last week, as the bleed is approaching, I become very forgetful. Typically I started a new job, for example, last year. I started a new job. Now, this is a great job. It's working with a third sector organisation called Bright Beginnings Children's Centre. So we really support parents from conception, and we're really focused on those kind of critical first 1001 days that we know is very important for children's brain development, and that attachment within the family situation. So we support a lot of parents with their mental health, and mental health in pregnancy is my special interest. I'm about to graduate with a master's in it towards the end of this year. This job had been created for me, and this is like a magical, lovely job that's designed to suit me, 9 till 2, term time only. You would think that I would get there on time and turn up to the right place, but I didn't, because I had it in my mind that I was meeting them somewhere else. We were meeting the team. I was to meet the team at a restaurant, some place that I don't know why I had in my mind that I was going to one place. And then I rang them to say, I'm guessing that you're not here because this place that I'm at is shut. It's like shut down. Where are we meeting? So then I was like 25 minutes late for my very first day. Where, 2 years ago, I would have turned up in floods of tears. I'm so sorry. Like, how can you ever forgive me for being 25 minutes late on day one? I was able to just go in there and say, sorry, I get mixed up. I thought it was over there. And ta-da, this is what it's going to be like to work with me. I'm going to go to the wrong place. I'm going to turn up late. I'm going to turn up on the wrong day because I'm in this week that I refer to now as my red week. And I'm far more likely to do that in that week than I am the other 3 weeks of the month. So yeah, sorry, but that's you take me as I am. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not. And I think it's very important to have an employer that can accept that and be flexible about it, because I don't ever leave on time, really. I do a lot of work in the evening, so actually it all balances itself out. And yeah, I know that they want me for the skills that I can bring to the organisation, and I'm not going to be reprimanded for those things because it is actually just part of my ADHD and my executive dysfunction.
Yeah, and as you said, like being yourself, and this is what it's gonna be, because it's not something that you can shut down, mask, or whatever. It's
No,
part of your personality and identity, and it is quite crucial for your employer, your family, your friends to support you as you are, not thinking that they can fix you. I
yeah,
think it's one of the biggest issues with a lot of mental health issues or other
yeah,
can you say
neurodivergent.
exactly disorders or some things, like people thinking like we need to fix them when it's part of people, and that doesn't make them like they have issues like having a disease or something. It's such a different thing, and this is one
Yes,
of the topics that I'm really like passionate about speaking about it, because we need to accept people as they are.
hugely.
um and I was curious because this is really, really fascinating what you said about having different hormones affecting you differently because you have ADHD during your menstrual cycle. Is that a topic that is actually researched good? And because I know that usually women's health is a bit under researched, and menstrual cycle is so complex and we learn new things every day. But this is really interesting to have an idea with complexities, if you have comorbidity with other issues or only one mental health issue, how this affects your menstrual cycle as well. Would you say you've read a lot about it, or there is much more to do?
I would say there's much. I would say there's much more to do. You know, some of the papers or the literature that I have read is quite heavy on the kind of the neuroscience aspect of it. I think what needs to happen is more qualitative research and understanding women's experiences of their menstrual cycles and how that relates to their moods and their ADHD symptoms or their symptoms of autism. I say symptoms, but actually, again, it's just characteristics of someone who is autistic
Mhm.
or someone who has ADHD. There is a bit more literature around autism and the menstrual cycle than there is for ADHD and the menstrual cycle. I think autism seems to be the front runner at the moment that we know a bit more about. There's a lot more research in terms of females and autism and how that intersects in terms of health. I think the ADHD has a bit of a there's a bit of a gap to bridge there now to
Mhm.
play catch up. Um, I think I actually, some people will say, "Oh, but everyone's a bit neurodivergent, aren't they?" Or everyone's on the spectrum these days, or etc. etc. But actually, I do take offence when people say that because it feels like it undervalues or
Yeah.
invalidates 37 years of struggling to understand myself, 37 years of masking, of feeling like an outsider, of at times feeling suicidal, not understanding yourself. So it feels like an invalidation then when people say, and I know they're well intentioned. They are trying to empathise or, oh yeah, I lose my car keys all the time, but not to the extent where it's chronic. And actually, I read something and I can't remember where I read it. It was a few weeks ago online and it said, saying that to someone who has autism or ADHD or both or whatever it is, or everyone's a little bit on the spectrum or everyone's a bit ADHD these days, is a bit like saying, oh, we're all a little bit pregnant. We're all a bit pregnant. No, we're not. We're not all a bit pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. You're either ADHD or you're not. To the point, and I think it's something that people need to stop saying because
Yeah.
it just continues to, it continues to invalidate people when they've had a lifetime of invalidation. I think there's huge strides that need to be happening in research, and I think it is beginning to happen. But as we know, it's a slow process. It's money, it's resources, all of those
Yeah.
things. So the more that we can have these conversations and have, people open up about their experiences, about what things have been like for them, and I think qualitative research, it seems to be a good place to start with that. And I think just to mention that there is absolutely no harm while you are on a waiting list, however long that might be. There's no harm in self-diagnosis, self-identifying, because if you feel that that picture fits for you, that criteria, the diagnostic criteria is, I think, in order to get a head start for yourself, you can absolutely identify as being ADHD or autistic, and see how that kind of psychological acceptance, see how that helps. Start employing some of the strategies that you might read about that might help, because I think our mental health is crucial, and I think it's dangerous, just because I've experienced it, I think it's dangerous to not have that self-acceptance and to not know about yourself at the core. So, neurodivergent people are at a huge risk of suicide for that reason, which is really sad. But I wonder how many of those neurodivergent individuals who previously have died by suicide might have been undiagnosed, and how might a diagnosis or that self-acceptance have helped their mindset and that self-forgiveness and self-compassion. I don't know, we're never going to know the answer to that, but it's just food for thought. I think that, and particularly postnatally, women are at a huge risk, because when we think about your estrogen levels in pregnancy, it's persistently high. And a lot of women will report that their mental health is better in pregnancy. Obviously, that's not the case for every single person who has ever been pregnant that has ADHD or autism. But generally speaking, on the whole, the majority of people find that their symptoms might be improved in pregnancy. And it's probably because the estrogen level is high and therefore the dopamine level is high. But once the placenta is born and removed, your estrogen levels take a very sharp drop, and therefore so do your dopamine levels. And then what happens? It's not a gradual decline like it happens, every 28 days. It's a very sharp drop. And there are many, many external factors that then makes it feel as if life is very overwhelming. You're sleep deprived. You're trying to keep this child alive. There's all of these societal expectations that, nobody ever actually verbalizes. And it's not really written anywhere that these are the rules of motherhood, but there is a lot of expectation on mothers within those kind of gendered roles. What does it look like to be a good mum? And all of those things, probably if you have ADHD, are unachievable. Having a very tidy, clean house and getting 8 hours of sleep a night and having your hair washed and managing to shower and do the food shopping and drop the kids off to school. And, all of those things are kind of silent pressures that we're putting on ourselves, not to mention your feeding choices or the type of nappy that you're going to be using for your baby. There's lots of things that are feeding into how we feel about ourselves and how we feel we are performing in terms of early motherhood, on top of the sharp drop of estrogen, therefore the sharp drop of dopamine, and the mental health pressures that then brings when you feel that sudden shift of hormones. And I think it's really important for women, whether you think you have ADHD, autism or not, all women, when they have babies, experience that huge hormonal shift.
Yeah.
And we've dressed that up now as, the baby blues. That period of time where you might be crying into your cornflakes. But do we explain well enough why that's happening? Because I think sometimes if people understand better, you can cope better with it, or you can anticipate it at least, and maybe do things to mitigate it. Like batch cooking before the baby's born, and asking your gran to come and stay with you for 2 weeks until things start to settle down type things. So I think the information and the education around it is really important.
Yeah, definitely. I 100% agree. And hearing it from many other people, that's definitely one step ahead if we put more education. And as our time is coming to an end, I wanted to ask you, just like in one sentence, following everything that you just said, what would be your advice if there is a pregnant new mom that could have or not have ADHD or whatever other diagnosis? How should she help herself with her mental health if she has all those negative thinking, like I'm a bad mom because I forgot about this or this?
I think write it down. You know, I love notebooks, but I definitely don't use them enough. I think there's something really powerful about just emptying your head of those thoughts, then revisit them maybe a few hours later and see how rational they might be or irrational. Is that really true? Is there any evidence of the things that you have written there? Like what is telling you? Where is the evidence for what you're telling yourself? I think emptying your narrative, putting it on paper, and then having a look at it a bit later on is really helpful, especially at bedtime, actually, because sometimes a lot of us kind of lie there and, we realise it's bedtime, and then all of a sudden that's the time the pressure is on. Then you're kind of processing your day, what has happened in that day, how do you feel about it? And then it can prevent us from sleeping. If you're anything like me and you're ruminating over it and you're over analysing everything, like, oh, I wonder what she thinks about me now because I don't know, I was late for whatever. I think just get it written down and get it out of your head and then revisit it later. And also, I mean, this is more than one sentence. I do apologise. We should have known I'd never have been able to curb it at that. I think talk to people, just be open about how you feel, because I guarantee most new mums will be feeling very similarly.
Hmm.
And if they're not, they're lying. If they're telling you that they don't feel like that, I don't think that's true.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really wonderful. And I've had a wonderful time. It was really interesting and I learned a lot. So thank you so much for sharing everything. It was really brave of you to share a lot of your personal moments as well.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been great to chat.